Hi, everybody. My name is Kesten Broughton, and I'm a lead security engineer at Praetorian, and I specialize in cloud services. So today I'm going to be giving a talk about an issue that I found. It kind of came at the end of an engagement, and I was it was a fortress basically. There was no way to get into this cloud. Everything was locked down really nicely. And then I woke up one morning, sort of actually a day after the engagement ended, and something was just stuck in my mind, and that was like somebody had used um, a timestamp for the external ID for this for a trust role to get into the account. Sorry, I'm just having troubles moving the slides along. My arrows are not working. Hang on just a second. I see. Here we go. All right, so back to the story. So I woke up one morning, and this just seemed a little bit odd that they were using a timestamp for something that was associated with transferring trust from a client to a vendor. And so that got me thinking, and I explored it a little bit. And then over the course of the following 3 or 4 months, I ended up looking at over and vendors, and of those, about half of them used only key-based access, and so they didn't apply to this sort of situation. But the other half, almost 100, did use cross-account role trust, which is a feature that AWS offers. And what I found was that the error rate was fairly high in terms of implementation. So for the UI, there was about 37% of these vendors doing something wrong that would make them vulnerable. And then if they got the UI right, they might still make errors in that they would only check things on the client side, and their APIs would allow things to be tampered with. So another 15% came into harm's way through that method. And so overall, we saw about 52% of AWS third-party vendors who are granting trust into their account using the cross-account role trust having issues. So how did we discover these? Well, I went to the AWS the marketplace and found a lot there. We did some searching through Google searches, AWS account ID, external ID, vendor trust, things like that. And then a number of them came from just work on various engagements for customers. So this is displaying a cloud mapper view of the Web of Trust module. And this is going to show in the yellow boxes known AWS account IDs. And then third-party vendors that are known, they get a logo. And then the black triangle represents an unknown account ID. So some 12-digit number that belongs to someone, and we just don't know an identity for them. And so this is where I would spend a fair bit of time researching. Very often that, the 999s here represented would belong to the customer, and it just wasn't given to us as part of the scope of the engagement. But other times it would be a vendor, and so then we would kick off this sort of like little research phase and see if we could get a free account. If they didn't offer free accounts, we weren't able to test them. And so I will thank AWS for really assisting us in reaching out to a lot of different vendors to be able to test them. I'm going to jump into a really quick demo here and then come back to the slides, and hopefully this works because hit and miss, but here we go. If you're able to see my screen, then that would be wonderful. All right, so the top portion here represents a vendor portal. So super secure, your cloud we will make. I've got different settings. This is a game that you can go to github.io and try it out yourself. The basic idea is any of these vendors, in order to establish trust, they require your account ID, a role name. Sometimes they combine those two together into the role ARN, and then the external ID. And the external ID is supposed to be controlled by them, never by you, the customer. And then they will give you a template, a role trust template that you're supposed to copy into your AWS portal. That's the bottom half here. And you should, when you copy everything into place, then you should be able to test the connection and find that it works. So this demonstration is going to assume that a victim's already gone through this. They've signed up with their vendor. They've applied their AWS account ID and their role name and used the default suggested external ID that the vendor told them to use. And so they would end up with an AWS account policy that looks something like this. They're trusting the 999 account that represents the vendor. And the permissions that are associated aren't shown here, but that's a factor in terms of what is the criticality or the risk of this issue for a given vendor. So one half of that comes from the difficulty, the trivial to secure aspect, and the other aspect comes from what privileges are associated with that vendor. Anyway, I'm going to demonstrate the easy attack very quickly for you. So you would find some way of getting the AWS account ID. I'll go into detail later about how you might be able to do that. And then you would need to find the role. So that can be done with Paku. So we wouldn't do this for anyone that we didn't have permission to do it on, for example, a bug bounty issue. But generally speaking, when I did these attacks, I wasn't doing any brute forcing. I was simply demonstrating that I could control these values. But if we were to simulate the brute force, then perhaps we were able to guess the role. And then finally, we would type in the secure role. I think I'm going to have to do this twice. Here, there we go. So we got the external ID, and that test, when it went to test connection and showed succeed, if I was able to do that on resources that weren't my own, that indicates that we've got an insecure vendor. So just going quickly through these, the easy attack would be if they had changed the external ID to something else that was fairly easy to guess. Tamper is the second row in that table that I was talking about, and that looks like this. So in this case, you might have a fairly strong. I think I need to pull up. I'm going to come back to this one later and do my tamper. I've only got it locally, and this is the one that's already pushed to GitHub. So we'll drop back now into the PowerPoint. But basically, that would we'll be able to see that in a slide down lower. So moving on, the IAM basics. This has been covered several times now since this is an afternoon talk. So I'm just going to point out what the icons are going to mean in this slide deck. The key here is for users, and that's typically humans or service accounts. And those are keys. Those keys are common across all clouds. So AWS, Google, or Azure will all have their form of a key, which looks like it's got a private identifier part, and then a private key part, the secret material, and then a public part that can be shown in logs and passed around. And then we've got the helmet, which represents roles, which are groups of policies and groups of permissions. And they split into two types for AWS. You have over here the authentication part, which is the trust policy. And then over here, you have the work toolkit, which represents the permissions that it can do. So in a little bit more detail, this is a trust policy, which establishes who can take the role. There could be things like Amazon Web Services. Those are AWS managed resources themselves, or there could be third-party things. And so in this case, they've allowed account 111 to come and assume this role using a particular specified role name. In the second case, they're using account 222 as being admitted to root. This is different from your AWS root account, which is tied to an email. This root specifies the account as a whole, and that delegation will be given to the admins of that account. And it turns out that, in fact, anybody who has STS assume role on star in that account would have the ability to assume this role. So the confused deputy issue is prevented using this condition block where the AWS assume role call can be passed an external ID, and that would have to match what is already in the policy. Excuse me while I get some water. All right, and on the right side is that impact part. That is like what is being allowed. If it were a S3 get and these were sensitive buckets, then that might put you into the medium or high risk, excuse me, realm of things. Okay, so just to summarize again, the goal of the cross-account trust is to take your resources in account B over here on the right and to grant accesses into your account from some account A, some third-party account. And the way that all clouds support, the key-based way, is to create a user account in the account B and then pass that back over here and then have that access the resources. The additional way that AWS supports is to have a user or role that can assume a role in the customer's account. In this case, there is no passing of secrets like in the key anchored case. There is only the passing of an external ID, which the vendor shows to the user, the customer, and the customer is supposed to include in their role policy. So it's a very different structure in terms of the flow of establishing that trust. Now, I want to be very clear that this is not a critique against using RBAC at all. Roles are fantastic, and we consider a best practice to be when you're granting a user to only grant it the ability to assume a role. So if you assume a role and the role has a hard to guess suffix, then you'll be able to prevent against some cases where you might have credential leakage. So this would be good, for example, if you committed a user key pair to GitHub or had it locked into a container when you burned the image. In those cases, if you only had the key and not the history, the command history, or logs or something like that, you would be fairly safe against having those keys leaked. In the case that, excuse me, in the case that those keys are leaked, then this is a serious problem. That's the main reason, one of the main reasons why AWS came up with this external ID instead of keys instead of keys access. Excuse me. I'm now going to drop into a little bit more of a deep dive on. So the main argument that I make is that isn't a typical shared key use case where you might have very commonly checked in keys to GitHub, or you might have those keys ending up in a Docker container. In this case, you have probably AWS open in one tab and your vendor open in the other tab. In AWS, you get the key if you're doing key-based access, and you pass it over to the vendor portal. And the vendor portal is supposed to swallow that away, put it into a database, and never show it to you again. And so in that case, there's very little chance that those keys would be leaked in that transfer process. So really, I think the main attack vector is on the database itself. And there, it's very true. If you were able to do SQLi, for example, and get those keys out of the database, then having the key and the secret out of the database would mean that you would be able to make calls and assume the role that you needed to, and get the all the information from the customer's account that the vendor supplies. Whereas if you extracted the role and the external ID and took them out here and didn't have any credentials from within this account to assume them, then you wouldn't be able to use them. However, that's only if you have only access to the SQL, the database. More likely, your attack vector is going to be the web server. And in the case of the web server, the web service is going to request from the database the credentials. And then the role and external ID would be used to exchange them for short-term temporary credentials. Those short-term credentials, those assume role keys, can be moved off of the instance and can be, in fact, renewed perpetually forever. And so although they are short-term, they can renew themselves, and you end up with a situation where it's not a whole lot better than having leaked a regular key. So how can we defend against that? Well, actually, before I leave this slide, I just wanted to point out one other thing, and that is, if you are using key-based access, you can really focus your trust zone down to a very small, subset of your infrastructure in AWS. It's really just the database here and the web server, and you can sort of shrink everything down so that you have a tight control around that area. Whereas if you're doing a trust to the entire account, you could have any compute resources anywhere in any region, as long as it's able to do an STS assume role, like say you've given someone Lambda full access so that they can do serverless architecture. If they've got an STS assume role on star in that Lambda policy, which is the default, then they would be able to make calls to target accounts as well. So my argument would be that if you're going to a microarchitecture account, like was discussed in the first talk today, where you have like a very granular AWS accounts and you don't have a ton of different things in there, then that's starting to lean towards when role and external ID would make sense. But if you've got a large monolithic account and a lot of potentially sort of higher, medium privileged roles out there, then this is becoming less secure because you're going to have to find ways to lock down all these other services. All right. So, what are other ways that we can protect? In fact, this method would protect against either the role-based or the key-based access, and that is, you could apply in your trust policy something that restricts the VPC from which it's called. So you could deny everything except a particular VPC that is owned in the vendor's account. And that way, whether you took off user credentials or whether you took off short-term STS assume role keys, you would be blocked from making calls. And so I think that actually satisfies a lot of what the concern was for doing cross-account assume role with roles only. On the right-hand side is probably not the right way to do it. You can specify just a source IP, but because they're ephemeral or they could be rotated or otherwise blocked, you could have a DDoS against a single IP. You probably would want to stay away from that. It's true that you might, at some point in the future, have to roll your entire infrastructure. But we kind of feel like the chances are in the future, if you're looking 3 or 4 years down the road, you would probably want to be updating any trust policies anyways, because there's likely to be future things like org VPCs or account VPCs coming down the pipeline where you can further restrict things. Thanks. All right. So basic general confused deputy. So here on the bottom, Bart, let's assume he lives in any other apartment door than 2B, and he makes a call to just have keys and have a shared key. They need to know which room that they can access, and that's what the external ID is there for. If Bart's able to trick the concierge, then he can have room cleaning or room service sent to room 2B. This is to just to distinguish it from other attacks like XSS, cross-site scripting, or SSRF, which is server-side request forgery, where you're actually tricking the web server to do things it never intended to do. In the case of the confused deputy, they are intended actions. They're just targeted to the wrong endpoint. So I'm going to skip over this because we already touched on this. This is the one that I wasn't able to demonstrate. And so this is an example of intercepting the traffic where you've hit the AWS integration create role. And then at this point, you're able to modify this traffic that would be represented in burp here before sending it along to the cloud. And that could give you a successful connection, allowing you to do the account takeover. All right, so how did we get here? These companies, a lot of them have been pen tested for years. Why didn't we catch it sooner? So one of the reasons is our tools were looking for the wrong thing in this case. This is Scout, which is another great tool. We love it. But it only checks for whether or not an external ID exists. And very often, external ID not existing indicates that it's another AWS account that you own as a customer, whereas it should also be checking for complexity in that external ID. I also think that the risk model doesn't emphasize enough the role of vendors. We often see that maybe 10 to 20 different vendors are gaining access into an enterprise customer's account. And so I'm very much looking forward to the 4:30 talk by Matthew Fuller on expanding our idea of the shared responsibility model. All right, so that's a recap of everything that was covered in the blog that was released 2 weeks ago on the AWS, on our Praetorian website. I'm now going to quickly go over a couple of new attacks. So the first one is called the drop external ID check. And at first, I didn't really think this was very significant, so I didn't include it in the tallies that you saw before. So this is all in addition to those tables that gave the stats on this. So here we have an assume role call. We pass in an IAM role, ARN, and we give it a session name. Here's the external ID part at the bottom. So the question is, do you think this would succeed or fail if the trust policy failed to include a condition block at all? Apparently, 75% of the people, when I asked this on Twitter, thought that it would fail. And it is true, thought that it would succeed. And it's true that it does succeed. When I learned that, it blew my mind. I had I was giving it 1% chance or less when I tested it out. And it turned out that this actually does succeed. The reason I think that's concerning is it's pretty clear that the role of trust is supposed to protect two parties. It's supposed to protect the client who is accepting the trust, and it's supposed to protect the vendor from being confused. And so the fact that this actually succeeds is a problem. It turns out that it's clearly specified here. This is at the bottom of about 4 or 5 page lengths. If you scroll down, this is the bottom fifth of the page. And here at the very bottom in green, I've expanded it in up here. on the left. And what it says is when you're making the check, when you're first accepting role of trust, you should first do the check with the external ID. And if it succeeds, then you do the check without, and it better fail, because if it doesn't, it means they didn't include the condition in your policy. And this one, I've seen very few people implement this one. I would say more than 90% of the vendors are not using this. So I want to emphasize the fact that this is a really important thing. Although it probably only affects 5% of the people, it does lead to a different attack, which I'm not going to be releasing today, but hopefully in the coming weeks. We wanted to give vendors as much time as possible to close that gap, but it does allow sort of some kind of strange attacks, unexpected attack surfaces to open up there. All right, so a few other things about the external ID that are a bit odd, given that it's secret material in the vendor context. It's not secret material in your AWS account, so it's logged in clear text. This I mentioned already. There is a probably 5% risk in general for all of those, all of those vendors that I looked at in the first round. But there's also a few special cases where it can lead to a much worse attack. The second thing that I wanted to mention was cross-account direct access. And so in this case, you're giving up the external ID because on the bottom here, direct access, where you're not assuming a role from the vendor. You're not going through a role to assume a resource. You're just directly granting access to a resource. This is super bad because there is no external ID option to pass to any AWS S3 call. So you can't put an external ID into the trust policy of a bucket, for example. And so that means if you see, in this case, I've represented with 333s. If you see 333, which is an external vendor, which allows multi-tenancy, that is, they take on lots of different customers, then you should shut that down immediately and contact the vendor. How do you get the role and ID? I'm going to leave this for another day, but account IDs are not secret. There's like 1,000,001 ways to get them. Spencer Geison's got a great one called Assume the Worst, where he lists a bunch, and here's a few more. Once you have the account ID, you can use Pacu to brute force all of the roles that are in there. Basically, this depends on how good your word list is. Again, brute forcing should only be done against your own account. And then that about wraps this talk. So props, I'd like to thank Scott Piper for making Cloud Mapper, and Spencer Geisen for Pacu. Daniel Grzelak actually discovered this issue and published it to GitHub in 2016. I discovered that about 2 months after I had been doing research on it. Thanks to Aidan Steele for asking super great questions about AWS all the time. It's led me to a couple of these variant attacks that I'm going to release in the future. And thanks to the AWS security team for helping reach out to all of the affected vendors. They've been really great at helping spread the word there. Finally, thanks to Praetorian for giving me the time to work on this project. And of course, we are hiring, and we have a really fun cloud team to work with. So that's it. I'm going to open up to questions now.
Sure. We only have time for a couple, but I did want to have two quickly because I know these are questions that people ask. Number one, how did vendors react to this? I know you did disclosure through AWS, but how did the vendors respond? And is this something we should be detecting for on our own?
Yeah, absolutely. So in general, the response was fantastic. Most of the people that I was able to contact would get in touch with me through email if I reported it that way, and set up a Zoom meeting in a couple of days, and really, really positively. Like, they were super thankful that they had no contact with me prior, and I was bringing this information to them. The bigger problem was contacting some vendors was actually quite difficult. So probably more than half didn't have security at email or any other way of contacting them except going through marketing, which often the ball got dropped there. So in general, if I was able to contact the right people at the company, fantastic response all around.
Detection techniques for this based on CloudTrail logs instead of scanning the environment.
Yeah, so it's actually pretty tough because you don't get that much information. It would have to be kind of about timing and load. So you as the attacker don't control when the calls are made. That's controlled by the vendor. And so if the vendor is making calls like at a certain rate, X, per day, and then all of a sudden that doubles, that would be an indication that somebody else has made this attack. Other than that, it's quite difficult to tell because the identity of the attacker is masked behind the identity of the vendor.
Well, thanks very much, Kesten. We'll take about a 5-minute break. We'll be back at 2:30 Eastern with Ryan Tick and Vaishnav Murthy, who will be talking about disk and memory evidence collection. Thank you very much, Kesten.
Thank you.